Imagine you're walking through the Valley of the Kings. The desert wind is still. The sun has long since dipped behind the cliffs, leaving the tombs in a hush so absolute it feels eternal. A priest descends into the earth, torch in hand. The stone walls glisten with pigments older than memory. Gods, falcons, serpents, and at the bottom, the golden face of a boy king waits in silence. They called him Tutankhamun, but under the layers of linen and myth, his body tells another story, not of divine perfection, but of collapse. A club foot, a curved spine, a cleft palate. His face, still youthful in death, is frozen in a piece his body never knew in life. He was just 19. This is where our journey begins, not with triumph, but with a whisper from the grave. A child god entombed in gold, broken from within. The Egyptians believed their pharaohs were gods on earth, divine bridges between the heavens and the Nile. Their blood was not merely royal, it was sacred, and sacred blood had to be kept pure. That meant isolation. Incest taught marriage is not of love or alliance, but of ritual and belief. Sister to brother, daughter to father, even mother to son. To us, it seems grotesque, but to them, it was order, purity, an unbroken line stretching back to the gods themselves. And yet, beneath the glittering crowns and sacred geometry of their temples, a slow death brewed in the marrow of these divine rulers. Each generation passed on not just power, but mutation, not just legacy, but frailty. In 2010, a sweeping DNA analysis of royal mummies confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected. Tutankhamun was the product of sibling marriage. His body, though buried in dazzling splendor, bore the marks of a genetic gamble that had failed. Scoliosis warped his spine. His foot was so deformed he likely walked with a cane. He suffered from malaria, and probably died from a broken leg made worse by infection and a weakened immune system. The irony could not be darker. A god in the eyes of men, but fragile, pained, and possibly disfigured from birth. But Tutankhamun was not alone. This was a dynasty shaped by an obsession. Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties, some of the most powerful in history, were built on a doctrine of purity that demanded the sealing of the bloodline. It was a fortress philosophy, and like all fortresses built too tight, it collapsed under its own weight. The stories we'll uncover in the chapters ahead are not about sin and shame. They are about fear, control, power, nilwa, nonal, and how a civilization's greatest strength, its belief in the divine, became its most fatal flaw. Because when gods marry their sisters, when queens are bred to be vessels not of love but of lineage, when the human body becomes a sacrament rather than a soul, something breaks. And the echoes of that break still whisper from tomb walls, bones, and genetic traces thousands of years later. This documentary will take you deep into those echoes. We will explore how sacred myths became scientific tragedies, how theology twisted family trees into snarled knots, how queens became prisoners of their wombs, and how pharaohs, once kings of the world, withered into fragile boys buried in golden coffins. We'll meet Akhenaten, the heretic king who married his daughters and rewrote the religion of the empire to suit his god complex. We'll meet Nefertiti, regal, mysterious, and possibly both mother and wife to her own son's heir. And we'll return again and again to Tutankhamun, not just a famous name, but a symbol of what happens when purity becomes poison. This is not merely a tale of ancient genetics. It is the story of how a civilization tried to make men into gods, and ended up making monsters of their myths. We begin where all myths end, in a tomb, where gold gleams, but flesh crumbles, and where the silence says more than scripture ever could. Imagine being born into a family where your spouse was chosen before you ever took your first breath, where your sister might be your queen, your aunt your bride, and your daughter, one day, your wife. This was not a scandal in ancient Egypt. It was law. Divine law. For in the land of the Nile, the Pharaoh was not a man. He was Horus made flesh, a living god whose bloodline mirrored the gods of creation themselves. And the gods, as every priest knew, had no need of outsiders. According to ancient Egyptian myth, the world was birthed from divine incest. Osiris and Isis, brother and sister, ruled as one. Their union produced Horus, the falcon-headed deity an avenger of his father's death. To the Egyptians, this was not taboo. It was sacred design. And what the gods did, the kings must echo. So pharaohs married their sisters to recreate divine harmony. These unions were not hidden in shame, they were proudly etched into temple walls, sung in hymns, immortalized in stone. Purity was not a suggestion. It was the very architecture of power. But this theology bred a dynasty of closed doors and echo chambers. Akhenaten, the infamous heretic king, stands as the most unsettling example. He ruled not just with his wife Nefertiti, but with his daughters, whom many scholars believe he later took as secondary wives. In the carvings of Amarna, his capital, we see scenes of the royal family so intimate they border on unsettling. The king cradling his daughters, lips grazing lips, his elongated face gazing with almost obsessive affection. His revolution against the old gods, dismantling the priesthoods and raising Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity, coincided with a radical collapse in Egypt's cultural balance. His god was abstract, light without a face. And in this isolation, Akhenaten built not just a new religion, but a dynasty that turned ever inward, genetically, politically, psychologically. He wasn't the first. In the generations before him, royal marriages routinely crossed lines modern society would find unthinkable. Thutmose I married his half-sister. Amenhotep III likely married his daughter. These alliances weren't born of romance or even strategy. They were ritualistic, calculated to preserve the divine spark at all costs. To mix blood was to risk dilution, and to risk dilution was to question the godliness of the throne itself. Yet the strategy had consequences. Each generation inherited not only the throne but the narrowing of its gene pool. What began as divinity soon resembled entrapment, a dynasty chasing its own tail, locked in a spiral of self-worship and slow genetic decline. Outside the palace, Egypt's nobility and peasantry maintained more conventional family structures. Cousin marriage was not uncommon, but the extreme incest of the royals was reserved for those who sat atop the pyramid. It was, in a grim sense, the ultimate privilege and the ultimate prison. Marriage in ancient Egypt was otherwise flexible. Women had rights. Divorce was possible. Love poems survived, tender and human. But in the royal house, love had no place. Only lineage did. The gods demanded purity. And so pharaohs became caretakers of a bloodline they dared not taint, even as it slowly sickened under its own weight. This was not ignorance. It was ideology. A theology so strong, it overpowered reason. A mythos so absolute, it swallowed reality whole. Even when stillbirths increased, even when deformities appeared, even when rulers weakened in body and will, they clung tighter to the logic that had led them here. They doubled down on sacred incest. In their temples, priests still carved the gods mating with their sisters. In their courts, the pharaohs still crowned their wives who had once shared their cradle. And in their tombs, they still wrote of eternity, as though the blood that failed them in life would redeem them in death. But time does not honor ideology. It reveals it. And what we now know, from bones, from DNA, from the quiet, crumbling inscriptions in limestone, is that divinity came at a price. It was not a myth that failed. It was a people who became prisoners of their own perfection. In the next chapter, we will descend deeper into the body of a god who never stood unaided, who ruled briefly and in silence, and whose very DNA tells the story of a dynasty in terminal decline. Tutankhamun, the golden boy with a broken spine. A god in name, but not in form. Imagine, you're standing inside a dark, narrow tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The air is dry, suffocating. A torch flickers. And there, behind a sealed stone wall, lies the most famous pharaoh in history. Not in majesty, but in silence, in fragility, in bone. Tutankhamun. For decades, he was known more for his tomb than for his life. A glittering sarcophagus. A golden mask with high cheekbones and serene lips. Chariots, daggers, jewels. The wealth of gods buried with a child barely out of adolescence. But beneath the beauty lay a tragic secret. When Tutankhamun's body was examined in the early 20th century, it was mishandled and partially destroyed. His corpse had been hastily embalmed, baked in resin and fire, blackened and brittle. For years we knew little beyond the legend. Then came 2010. That year, a comprehensive genetic and CT scan study, led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, revealed a haunting truth. Tutankhamun was the product of incest. His parents were full siblings, and the results were written into his flesh. He suffered from a club foot. His spine was curved, possibly from scoliosis. His palate was cleft. His left foot bore signs of necrosis. He could barely walk unaided. Dozens of walking sticks were found buried with him, not symbols of royal hunting as once assumed, but medical necessity. And in his DNA, researchers found traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for malaria. A boy god, limping through life in pain, weakened by inherited deformities and ravaged by disease. The young pharaoh ruled for just 9 years. He took the throne at about 9 years old and died by 18 or 19. His death remains a subject of debate. Malaria, bone disease, a broken leg. Possibly all of them, working in concert against a body too fragile to endure. But what endures is the symbolism. Tutankhamun, buried in gold, is the face of ancient Egypt to the modern world. His mask, one of the most iconic artifacts of human civilization, projects an illusion of power and beauty. Yet behind it was a boy, isolated, in pain, trapped in a legacy he did not choose. His name was not always Tutankhamun. He was born Tutankhaten, a child of Akhenaten, the heretic king who defied the gods of Egypt in favor of the singular sun deity, Aten. After Akhenaten's death and the collapse of his religious revolution, the court hurried to restore the old ways. The boy's name was changed. His image was shaped. He was married to his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, and he was pushed onto the throne as a symbol of restoration, a living god for a weary people. But how do you restore a kingdom with a king who can barely stand? Tutankhamun's reign was ruled by regents, powerful advisors like Ai and Horemheb, who wielded real power while the boy king played his role. His job was not to lead, but to be seen, to smile, to bless, to remind Egypt that its gods had returned. Yet the gods had changed. The evidence from his tomb suggests a rushed burial. His chambers were small, unfit for a pharaoh. His artifacts, while rich, included repurposed items, perhaps even originally made for someone else. His body, as if scorched by hurried embalming, was entombed in a mixture of confusion and concealment. The grandeur was a mask, and the boy behind it was fading fast. We do not know if Tutankhamun understood the trap he was born into. We cannot ask him how he felt, ruling a kingdom that had turned his life into a myth while his body rotted beneath royal silks. But his remains speak loudly. He is the clearest proof of what Egypt's obsession with divine blood wrought. Here was a king born of gods, yet crippled by their logic. A boy groomed for eternity, who could not survive his teens. His image, immortalized in gold, tells one story. His bones tell another. And that dissonance, between symbol and reality, between divine purity and human suffering, lies at the heart of this dynasty's tragedy. As modern science peeled back the linen layers of Tutankhamun's legacy, what emerged was not a glorious ruler, but a medical autopsy of incestuous collapse. The very logic of purity had devoured its own child. And Egypt, despite all its wisdom, did not stop here. In the next chapter, we leave the tomb and return to the palace. There, behind gilded walls and ceremonial titles, were the women, the sisters, daughters, and nieces, whose wombs bore the next generation of gods and the next wave of tragedy. Their stories are rarely carved into stone, but their silence is deafening. Imagine, a princess, no more than 12, is led through the echoing halls of the royal palace. Her ankles jingle with gold. Her face is painted for celebration, but the man waiting to marry her is her father. In ancient Egypt, love was not a requirement. Neither was choice. What mattered was blood, undiluted, divine, eternal. In the name of that sacred lineage, the bodies of royal women became temples and prisons all at once. In the shadow of every pharaoh stood women whose names history barely whispers. Daughters, sisters, nieces, handed over as brides to preserve a fragile illusion that the divine could be kept pure if it never left the family. This was not a footnote in Egyptian life. It was doctrine. The mythology of the gods themselves taught it. Osiris married his sister Isis. Their union birthed Horus, the falcon-headed avenger and rightful heir. To imitate the gods, pharaohs married their own sisters, and sometimes, in darker moments, their daughters. In the twisted mirror of divine imitation, incest was no longer taboo. It was holy. And yet the toll was real. Royal women, especially during the 18th and 19th dynasties, were often reduced to vessels. Their purpose was simple: produce a male heir. But when the gene pool narrowed to a trickle, the cost was devastating. Stillbirths were common. Child mortality soared. The remains of many royal infants, discovered in tombs near Tutankhamun's, reveal congenital deformities and premature death. These were not isolated tragedies. They were a pattern, a consequence of forced purity. The story of Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun's half-sister and wife, captures this agony. She was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, born to the most radical family in Egyptian history. As a teenager, she married her half-brother Tutankhamun. Together they tried, or were made to try, to stabilize a fractured nation. But their union bore no living children. 2 mummified fetuses were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, likely stillborn daughters. Her story ends in desperation. After her husband's death, Ankhesenamun wrote a letter, a unique and shocking plea, to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's enemy, asking for a foreign prince to marry her. "I am afraid," she wrote. "I have no son." The request was unprecedented. No Egyptian queen had ever asked a foreign power to send a king. It was, in some ways, an act of rebellion, a cry against the genetic dead end of incest. But her plea went unanswered, or rather, intercepted. The Hittite prince sent to Egypt was murdered en route, and Ankhesenamun vanishes from history soon after. She was never meant to choose. She was only meant to breed. And she was not alone. Royal women like Sitamun, daughter and wife of Amenhotep III, lived lives of ceremonial visibility and personal invisibility. Others, like Nefertiti, may have wielded political power, but even that was tied to their proximity to divine bloodlines. Even when they ruled through their wombs. In rare cases, women became pharaohs themselves. Hatshepsut famously ruled in the 18th dynasty, donning the false beard of kingship. But her reign was exceptional, and her legacy was nearly erased by those who followed. Egypt's elite were not comfortable with women in power unless it was reproductive. Wombs mattered. Minds did not. Medical evidence shows that the toll of this system was staggering. Pelvic deformities, malnutrition, high maternal death rates, and the silent grief of mothers forced to bury child after child. Their pain was sacred, their suffering, state-sanctioned. The tombs of royal women, when found, rarely matched the grandeur of their husbands or sons. Many were buried hastily. Some vanished altogether. Others were sealed into side chambers, their names lost in the bureaucracy of dynastic decay. But perhaps the most haunting detail lies not in stone, but in pattern. For centuries, the same formula repeated. Royal women married off young, isolated within harems, used to birth pure sons. And when those sons died, the daughters were cycled back into the arms of uncles, brothers, fathers. A genetic loop, a closed system of decay. Modern Egyptologists, especially feminist scholars, have begun to re-examine these women not just as footnotes, but as focal points. Their lives, often overlooked, tell us more about Egypt's downfall than any single king. They were the ground on which the fantasy of divine purity was built and buried. Nefertiti, so often remembered for her beauty, may have carried more burden than we know. If she was indeed the mother of Tutankhamun, as some genetic models suggest, then she too was part of this tragic legacy. Her elegance, immortalized in busts and carvings, masks a deeper story, one of genetic entrapment and imperial expectation. Even Cleopatra, queen of the Ptolemies centuries later, was a product of this same thinking. Her family tree is a tangle of sibling marriages and closed loops. By the time she ruled, the dynasty's bloodline had thinned to a whisper of its origins. Purity had become poison, and the women were its reluctant vessels. In the end, what remains are bones, names, fragments of jewelry, echoes of palace whispers, but their silence speaks. The inbred dynasties of Egypt did not fall solely because of war or politics. They crumbled in part because their women were sacrificed to an idea, the idea that power must remain within, even at the cost of life itself. They bore the burden of the gods, And in doing so, they carried Egypt toward its grave. Imagine ruling a kingdom where no one dares contradict you. Not because they agree, but because they believe you are a god. Now imagine being told, since the day you were born, that your blood is sacred, that your body is divine, that your thoughts are prophecy. You are the Son incarnate. Even as your bones ache, your limbs fail, and your mind begins to fracture. Such was the paradox of Egypt's most isolated kings. Inbreeding did not only affect the body, it gnawed at the mind. As genetic lines looped ever tighter, the psychological cost of divine insularity became undeniable. Pharaohs, trapped in echo chambers of blood and ideology, began to unravel. And at the center of that unraveling stands one of Egypt's most controversial rulers, Akhenaten. Akhenaten was not merely eccentric. He was revolutionary, and possibly disturbed. Born Amenhotep IV, he took power in the 18th dynasty, but soon rejected the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods. He shut down temples, defaced sacred monuments, and built a new capital from scratch, Akhetaten, a city for one god. Aten, the sun disk. Some saw genius in his monotheism, others saw madness. His portraits are famously strange. Elongated skull, narrow face, wide hips, pendulous lips, distended stomach, images that depart drastically from traditional pharaoh depictions. Was it artistic symbolism, or physical deformity caused by genetic inbreeding? The jury is still out. But modern scholars and doctors have speculated about Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, or a blend of hereditary disorders, conditions more likely when the parents are closely related. Akhenaten, like many of his ancestors and descendants, was the child of a closed bloodline. But the real fracture was not in his bones, it was in his theology. Akhenaten didn't just change religion. He isolated his kingdom, cut ties with traditional priesthoods, and ordered that only his family could worship the sun god directly. His belief system was not shared, it was hoarded. Divine access, like blood, became exclusive. This control echoed delusion. He and his queen, Nefertiti, are often depicted worshipping the Aten alone, as beams of sunlight pour directly onto their faces. It was as if the entire cosmos revolved around their love and their blood. When you believe you are the only conduit to God, how long before you believe you are God? This messianic self-image would echo in later pharaohs, each increasingly withdrawn, paranoid, and obsessed with divine affirmation. The records show a shift. In earlier dynasties, pharaohs were strong, visible, engaged in public rituals. But by the time of Akhenaten and his successors, inscriptions grow fewer, monuments shrink, and rulers become more elusive, hidden behind priests, walls, and masks. Some scholars now believe that this withdrawal was not simply political, it was psychological. We see signs of intense paranoia. Rulers who change their names multiple times, likely to appease omens or conceal heritage. Kings who eliminated entire branches of their family tree from public record, deleting siblings, cousins, rivals. Others who outlawed foreign names, foreign gods, and even foreign marriages for fear of contamination. The fear of impurity had become madness. In medical literature, incestuous reproduction, especially over generations, can result not only in physical deformities, but in cognitive dysfunction and mental illness. Modern geneticists point to increased risks of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and personality disorders when consanguinity, close relative breeding, persists. While it is impossible to retroactively diagnose ancient rulers, the behavioral evidence is unsettling. Consider the late Ptolemies, Greek-Egyptian rulers, who mimicked the incest traditions of earlier dynasties. Ptolemy VIII, for instance, married his own sister and was notorious for his cruelty and erratic behavior. He murdered his own son, mutilated enemies, and staged bizarre, lavish religious ceremonies to affirm his rule. Ancient sources describe him as obese, unstable, and violently unpredictable. Divinity, once aspirational, had turned grotesque. These were not merely bad rulers. They were trapped in a system that elevated their isolation into doctrine. The result was not enlightenment. It was a descent into narcissism, delusion, and at times, sadism. In the need to prove godliness, some pharaohs began identifying so strongly with deities that they lost touch with human constraint. Some performed rituals where they married the goddess Maat, the embodiment of truth and order, suggesting that they alone embodied justice. Others underwent sacred rebirth ceremonies where they were wrapped in mummy bandages, placed in coffins, and resurrected to symbolize their immortality. What was once symbolic had become self-consuming. Power, relief, and mental strain had fused. The final proof of decay, perhaps, lies in their paranoia about death. Later dynasties built increasingly elaborate tombs, not to welcome the afterlife, but to defend against it. Secret passages, false doors, traps, and decoy chambers littered the tombs of rulers, terrified of being disturbed. Some even cursed their own graves, threatening death to those who would dare approach. Why such fear from the gods? Because somewhere, buried beneath the golden ritual, there must have been doubt. Doubt that the body could carry the burden of divinity. Doubt that blood, no matter how carefully preserved, could keep the soul intact. Doubt that the voices in their heads were gods or ghosts. In the end, Egypt's most isolated kings were not divine. They were men. Men with fragile bones and brittle minds, trapped by a myth that had lost its meaning, but not its grip. Imagine a bloodline so fiercely guarded, so obsessively purified, that it begins to devour itself. The later dynasties of ancient Egypt, especially the waning years of the 18th and the Hellenistic Ptolemies, would become a tragic testament to the fatal logic of inbreeding. What was once seen as divine continuity became poison in the veins of kings. At the height of its power, Egypt's royal house believed its survival depended on marrying within. Pharaohs took their sisters, daughters, even mothers as brides. Their temples glorified this tradition as sacred, echoing the myth of Osiris and Isis, the primordial brother and sister whose union birthed gods. But no myth could disguise the consequences forever. By the 19th dynasty, the toll was becoming impossible to ignore. Stillbirths, infant mortality, rulers who reigned only months or even days before succumbing to unnamed illnesses, queens who vanished from history after repeated, failed pregnancies. The genealogical trees of Egypt grew twisted and thin, branches curling in on themselves. Medical anthropologists now suspect that several rulers of this period suffered from genetic disorders related to hemophilia, immune deficiencies, and metabolic syndromes, all made exponentially worse by repeated incestuous pairings. One royal mummy, likely belonging to Pharaoh Siptah, reveals a severe clubfoot and curvature of the spine, conditions that hint at genetic damage common in highly consanguineous lineages. Even the crown itself began to falter. The line of succession grew increasingly chaotic as fewer healthy heirs were born. Brothers and half-brothers fought bitterly for the throne. Queens, once revered, became pawns, married off again and again within the family in desperate bids to salvage dynastic purity. But the worst was yet to come. With the fall of native Egyptian dynasties came the rise of the Ptolemies, Macedonian Greeks who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. Eager to legitimize themselves in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects, the Ptolemies embraced, and even intensified, the tradition of incest. They married siblings, repeatedly, for generations. The result was a dynasty so insular, so aggressively inward-looking, that by its final century, it had become a caricature of divine delusion. Ptolemy too married his full sister Arsinoe. So did Ptolemy IV Thor, and Ptolemy VIII Tates. Some of these unions ended in assassination. Others ended in madness. But nearly all of them ended in decay. One queen, Cleopatra II, married her brother, Ptolemy VI, then later married another brother, Ptolemy VIII, who was so reviled he earned the nickname Physcon, meaning the fat. He, in turn, murdered one of Cleopatra's sons, dismembered the body, and sent it to her as a birthday gift. This was not love. This was a dynasty collapsing into psychosis, enabled by its obsession with blood. By the time Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, came to power, the Ptolemaic lineage was already severely compromised. She too married her brother, as tradition demanded, but ruled alongside Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in an effort to secure Egypt's independence. Even then, the shadow of inbreeding remained. Her son Caesarion, rumored to be Caesar's child, was raised with the same dynastic expectations of divine blood, and was executed by Octavian at the age of 17. Cleopatra's suicide marked the end of pharaonic rule in Egypt. But her story was only the final chapter of a much longer tragedy. In seeking to preserve the gods within their blood, Egypt's rulers had forgotten the human body's limitations. They had mistaken lineage for strength. They had confused myth for immunity. They believed that by closing the circle, by never letting the sacred blood mix with the ordinary, they could make themselves eternal. But isolation is not eternity. It is extinction in slow motion. By the end, even the people had begun to lose faith. Priests no longer praised the purity of the royal line with the same fervor. Inscriptions grew less ornate, tombs less ambitious. The grandeur of empire gave way to a hushed resignation, a recognition that the blood of gods had turned stale. In modern terms, Egypt's royal collapse was not only political, it was biological. The dynasty had strangled itself with its own rules, its own fear of dilution, and in doing so it ensured the very outcome it feared most: vulnerability, weakness, and ruin. The temples still stood, the rituals still echoed. But behind the walls, the kings were dying young, dying sick, dying mad. The throne, once a symbol of divine vitality, became a death sentence gilded in gold. And beneath it all, running like a dark current, was the fatal obsession with purity. Not spiritual purity, not ethical purity, but genetic, ancestral, dynastic purity, an illusion that blood can sanctify, that power can be distilled like wine, that godhood is hereditary. What remained of this obsession was dust, crumbling statues, broken bones, tombs filled with beauty and silence. The great Egyptian experiment in divine bloodlines had failed, not because of outside invasion or lost battles, but because the body could no longer bear the myth it was forced to embody. The dynasty had bred itself into a corner, and found, too late, that there was no way out. Imagine the silence of a sealed tomb, not the kind that holds treasure, but the kind that holds regret, lined not with gold, but with the brittle bones of 1,000 decisions made in the name of eternity. Here in the Valley of the Kings, we end where we began. A crown once gleaming with divine legitimacy now rests atop an empty skull. The body beneath it, twisted and worn, tells no stories of conquest. It speaks only of lineage, of sacred unions that bred sickness, of royal heirs doomed by a fear of mixing blood, and of a civilization so terrified of contamination, it consumed itself from within. This final chapter is not one of judgment, but of reflection. Egypt's most powerful families did not see themselves as cruel or foolish. They believed, with the conviction of gods, that they were preserving order, balance, ma'at. To them, incest was not a taboo. It was a sacrament, a ritual, a reenactment of divine myths that stretched back to the first days of creation. But myths do not obey biology. The laws of genetics, invisible, immutable, made no exceptions for those with gold scepters or sacred names. Chromosomes twisted, mutations bred, bodies failed, minds fractured, all in service of a dream to keep the blood of gods untainted. And that dream became a coffin. As the dynasties aged, as the names of kings grew longer and their reigns shorter, Egypt's divine order began to collapse in on itself. Palaces filled with whispers of infertility, tombs filled with infants, temples preserved in marble what the body could no longer sustain in flesh. By the time Rome arrived, Egypt was already hollowed out. The last pharaohs, figures like Cleopatra, stood atop a throne built on dust. They wore the trappings of majesty, but their blood carried centuries of decline. The gods had married themselves for too long, and what they birthed was not immortality, but extinction. Yet there's something hauntingly human in all of this, a desire to hold on, to preserve, to believe that greatness can be passed down like a relic, guarded, unaltered, pure. The pharaohs were not just tyrants or fools. They were symbols of a fear we all carry. That change is contamination. That purity is safety. That what makes us divine must never be touched by the outside world. But history whispers a darker truth. Purity, when taken to its extreme, is poison. Empires need adaptation, not insulation. Families need openness, not obsession. And power, unchecked by humility or biology, curdles into decay. So we end not with condemnation, but with a question. What myths are we still clinging to? About blood, about legacy, about who deserves to rule? What rituals of exclusion do we still perform? thinking they make us strong, when all they do is make us fragile. The tomb of Egypt's most inbred dynasty offers no answers. Only silence. The kind that fills a sealed chamber. The kind that lingers after the last torch dies. The kind that speaks, not through words, but through what's left behind. A bent femur. A malformed skull. A golden mask too perfect for the broken child beneath it. A throne built on ashes. And beneath it all, the dust of gods,